Hello, everyone. My name is Will Gunn, and I am this year's chairman for Law Day. It's a pleasure to welcome you to today's event, Law Day 2021, Advancing the Rule of Law, a Global Perspective. Today's program is a partnership between the American Bar Association and the Law Library of Congress. We're happy that you've been able to join us. As some of you may know and others may not, Law Day has been celebrated by the United States and spearheaded by the ABA, the American Bar Association, since the 1950s. Law Day is intended as a day to focus in on the role of law in American society. As far as this year is concerned, Law Day is celebrated officially on May 1st. However, we've actually been in the midst of a Law Day campaign that we'll talk more about later. This campaign, which started roughly a month ago, will continue on. And if you would like to find out more about Law Day and the activities involved with it, I invite you to go to our website, www.lawday.org. And we invite you to get involved as well. Today, we're going to have a moderated discussion, a panel discussion, and you'll have time to ask questions. If you'd like to ask questions, then I invite you to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Today's program is being conducted via Zoom webinar and is also being live streamed via YouTube. I'd like to introduce our partner for today's program, the Acting Law Librarian of Congress, Ashlihan Balut. Ashlihan?
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the 2021 commemoration of Law Day. Thank you for joining us. I am Aslihan Bulut, and I have the honor of serving as the Acting Law Librarian of Congress. And we are very happy to and pleased to co-sponsor this Law Day panel with the American Bar Association. Law Day is a national day set aside to celebrate the rule of law and an opportunity to understand how law and the legal process protect liberty and promote justice. And this year's program will explore the rule of law from an international perspective, which is well suited for us because the Law Library's specialty is foreign and comparative law. We are the largest law library in the world, and it often surprises people when they learn that the majority of our collection is in a language other than English. We employ legal specialists from around the world to use our collection to create foreign and comparative law reports for Congress that discuss how different jurisdictions approach the regulation of a particular issue. For example, one of our most popular reports discusses how countries around the world have approached the regulation of Bitcoin. I am excited to announce that this week, the Law Library launched a new crowdsourcing campaign related to our historical foreign and comparative law reports. The Law Library has an archive of reports dating back to the 1940s that we want to make accessible to researchers. So to accomplish this, we have begun digitizing and publishing these historical reports online at loc.gov and have selected several hundred to be added to the library's By the People crowdsourcing platform, where volunteers can transcribe these reports to make them full text searchable for researchers. And many of these reports have never been seen by the public, and they provide a fascinating look at the history of US law and policy, particularly from the Cold War era. So I would encourage you to visit crowd.loc.gov to explore this historic collection and try your hand at transcribing a report. Thank you so much. Back to you, Will.
Thank you, Aslan. At this point, I'd like to introduce the president of the American Bar Association, Trish Rifo. Trish formerly served as the chair of the American Bar Association's House of Delegates, and she serves as a partner in the Phoenix, Arizona firm of Snell and Wilmer. As ABA president, Trish chose this year's theme, Advancing the Rule of Law Now. Trish?
Thank you, Will, and hello, everyone. Welcome to this Law Day special event. You know, just by attending, you are all promoting awareness of and appreciation for the bedrock of our free society, the rule of law. Presidents of the American Bar Association each year have the honor of selecting a National Law Day chair. And I was really smart in the one that I picked. I could not have chosen a wiser or more inspiring leader than Will Gunn. Will, thank you for your work as Law Day chair this year, but more importantly, thank you for your career-long work to promote access to justice for all under the rule of law. We are all thrilled that you will soon assume your new role as Vice President for Legal Affairs and General Counsel of the Legal Services Corporation, the federal agency that supports free legal assistance for low-income Americans. The rule of law demands that all persons, regardless of their ability to pay, should have access to legal representation. And the American Bar Association looks forward to working with you, Will, in your new role with the Legal Services Corporation to ensure equal justice under law. Let me also thank our moderator, our panelists, the ABA Division for Public Education, and especially the Law Library of Congress for their support for today's event. A thriving Law Library of Congress is essential to preserve the rule of law, and the ABA is a proud partner and longtime supporter. We join you all in mourning the recent loss of our friend and colleague, law librarian Jane Sanchez, and we welcome you, Aslihan, as acting law librarian. ABA presidents also have the privilege of selecting the year's Law Day theme. For 2021, as you've heard, in consultation with Will, we chose the theme, Advancing the Rule of Law Now. The rule of law provides a bedrock of consistency and fairness in our society during times of peace and times of war, during periods of calm and periods of crisis, during times of civil order and times of civil unrest, during times of safe public gatherings and times of mask wearing and social distancing. The rule of law is with us when we are comfortable and secure and when we are shocked by violence and injustice and demand change. Now is always the time to advance the rule of law. Societies can rely on the rule of law to protect and expand rights, to advance justice for all, and to enact positive change to secure the blessings of liberty for ourselves and our posterity. We do this here at home by providing pro bono legal services to the poor, by working for free and fair elections, or by advocating for causes that bend the arc of the moral universe toward justice. And we do this abroad by helping emerging democracies develop fair and open systems of law and justice, and by bearing witness to and holding governments accountable for human rights abuses and other injustices. So thank you again, everyone, for being here to support Law Day. The American Bar Association appreciates your leadership in your communities to promote civic awareness through Law Day this year and every year. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Trish. I appreciate your words. At this point, I'd like to turn the floor over to Elizabeth, Betsy Anderson, the head of the World Justice Project, who's going to be serving as our moderator for today's program. Betsy?
Thank you very much, Will. And if I can invite my fellow panelists to also turn on their cameras and join me. It's really a terrific honor to be invited to moderate today's very important and timely discussion of the rule of law. I'm extremely grateful for this opportunity, and to the ABA and to the Law Library of Congress for hosting this important discussion. The theme for this year's Law Day, Advancing the Rule of Law Now, underscores the urgency of this call. And I think we will hear from our panelists today from perspectives around the world about that urgency. Law Day is first and foremost a focus on the role of law in the United States, but today's discussion broadens our lens and looks to rule of law dynamics around the world. And we really could not have a better panel to provide perspective on this topic. I'm very pleased to welcome to the panel three experts who have worked in a variety of ways on rule of law topics in different parts of the world. They are Ambassador Timuri Yakubashvili, who is a career diplomat from the Republic of Georgia. He's been involved in a variety of rule of law related projects in governments and assistance of governments around the world, and also served with distinction as the Ambassador of Georgia to the United States from 2010 to 2013. Joining Ambassador Yakubashvili, we have Jenny Gesley, who is a foreign law specialist at the Law Library of Congress, one of those experts in comparative law that we heard about earlier. Jenny focuses her research on Europe, and specifically Germany, Austria, Switzerland, and Liechtenstein. And third in our panel, we have Ashley Kwarku, who is a senior fellow with the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in their Democracy, Conflict, and Governance program. Her research focuses on threats to democracy, social and political polarization, and comparative approaches toward building social cohesion and democratic renewal. So welcome to my panelists. Our discussion this morning will have three segments. I will begin with a stage setting presentation about the World Justice Project's rule of law data around the world to give us some context for the discussion. Then I will invite my three colleagues to join with me in discussion about rule of law dynamics around the world. And after about 45 minutes, we will open it up for discussion with the audience. I invite you to pose your questions as they occur to you in the Q&A function at the foot of your screen. And our colleagues will feed those questions to me when it comes to that time. So let me begin with some stage setting, as I've mentioned, drawing on the data of the World Justice Project. The World Justice Project is a non-governmental organization based in Washington, D.C., with offices in Seattle, Mexico City, and Singapore. We work to advance the rule of law around the world through research, data collection, and analysis in support of a global network of change makers. The Law Library and the ABA are critical partners in that work every day. I thought it would be helpful to share with you the data from the World Justice Project's Rule of Law Index 2020. And so you can see that hopefully on your screen. Well, we've not got the right screen yet. I'll begin while we're getting the slides keyed up. There we go. All right. World Justice Project Rule of Law Index measures the rule of law across 9 dimensions of the rule of law. Actually, it tends to be 8 because informal justice, we gather that data in some countries, but not all. And so it's really the first 8 of these different dimensions of rule of law that we use to evaluate governance in countries around the world. This is what is often referred to as a thick definition of the rule of law. It encompasses many different factors. It focuses both on the laws and institutions and their work in practice, the implementation of law, as well as the existence of law on the books. It also looks at the substantive features of that law and evaluates its compliance with international standards of human rights. These 8 factors in the Rule of Law Index are then broken down into sub-factors, 44 in all. So you can see, for example, the constraints on government powers we evaluate across 6 different dimensions. What are the checks and balances on government powers from the legislature, the judiciary, from audit agencies, independent inspectors general and ombudsperson? What are the checks from law enforcement when a government official abuses their authority? Are they held accountable? What are the checks from non-governmental organizations and from the media? And similarly, each of the 8 factors is broken down into sub-factors in this way in our index. We use the index to measure the rule of law in 128 countries in 2020. In 2021, it will cover 140 countries. And the methodology draws on the perspectives of the users of the legal system, that is, citizens and lawyers and other experts who have perspective on that system. We undertake surveys in each country in which we are seeking to measure the rule of law. And then the answers to those survey questions, some 500 in all, are aggregated into scores for each factor and each sub-factor in each country. Let me turn then to the results from 2020. You can see here, it's the print I know is very fine, but perhaps looking at the map, you can appreciate this is a snapshot of the rule of law globally, with the more green colors having stronger rule of law, moving toward red with weaker rule of law, and yellow in the middle. Here are the top performers and bottom performers in 2020. And I would say that this is quite stable across years. Countries don't move up and down in the rankings very dramatically. You can see there's more movement in the lower 10 than in the top 10. And this is a feature of the rule of law that we'll discuss with our panel, that it doesn't change dramatically over time, that building the rule of law, improving the rule of law is a long-term project. Our viewers may wonder where the United States is. The United States came in at 21 this year in 2020 in the Rule of Law Index, for the first time falling out of the top 20 in our rankings. Here is a picture that demonstrates movement in the rule of law between 2019 and 2020. And this is where a rather sobering picture begins to emerge. What we saw in 2020 for the 3rd year in a row was more countries declining in their score. That would be yellow or orange in this picture. More countries declining than improving. So more yellow and orange than blue. And we saw this declining trend in every region in the world, in developed rich countries as well as developing countries, and in various regime types. It is a broad trend across the globe. And again, something that we'll be eager to hear from our panel about. This shows these trends over multiple years. And again, the print is very fine, but there's a story behind this chart that I want to underscore. And that is, if you see, the countries are listed all along the side in each of these 3 columns. And then in each of the shaded columns adjacent to them, green or blue means progress, improving rule of law in each of the last 5 years, 4 years. The red is declining rule of law. And the picture that emerges is that very rarely is a country moving consistently up or down in multiple years over time. What we see is a consistent pattern of ebbs and flows in almost every country. What is also interesting is that the countries that are most consistently improving, that is, that are improving in this chart, in each of the 4 columns, tend to be those with the strongest rule of law. So Denmark, which ranks #1 in the world, doesn't have much room to improve, yet it continues to improve in each of the 4 years in this ranking, suggesting that there is a certain momentum that may develop where there is strong rule of law. But we'll be interested to hear from our panelists about this dynamic of ebbs and flows and what helps us turn the corner from a green to a red, and or from a red to a green, and then to sustain that progress. This is a slide that demonstrates the trends that we are seeing in our data over multiple years. Now, I mentioned that we saw in 2020 declining rule of law in every region in the world, more countries declining than improving. And unfortunately, that is a trend that we see over multiple years, and particularly in these 3 factors: constraints on government powers, absence of corruption, and fundamental rights. So what you see in the bars below the line, those are the countries that have been declining in the solid over the last year, in the hashed panel over 3 years. And so we can see in each of these areas that we have a negative trend over both the short and the long term. This really reflects that same data on constraints against constraints on government powers, but in a map form. And again, you can see over 5 years, the number of countries that are yellow and orange here that have been declining in that factor. And let me point out again, the United States declining negative 1.5% in that period. All of this data is available on your website. I invite you to poke around at our website, and you can sort the data by country and region and income group and factor and sub-factor, but don't do that yet, because we have a great discussion awaiting you. And with that, I'll ask the screen to be taken away and to invite my panelists to join me and help us understand this data from their perspective, working on rule of law topics around the world. So if I may dive in, colleagues, one dimension of the rule of law that emerges in this World Justice Project data that I mentioned is its complexity, this multifaceted nature of the rule of law, and the fact that progress is not linear, that we see this start process of progress. We see ebbs and flows in rule of law over time. To begin our discussion, I want to ask each of you to share your perspective on those dynamics, on the process of rule of law progress and how you have seen it develop in different regions. And if I may begin with you, Ambassador, can you describe for us the dynamics that you have witnessed in rule of law progress? And in particular, what you have described to us in an earlier conversation, the transition from law of the ruler to rule of law.
Thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be among such illustrious people. One disclaimer, I'm not a lawyer. I'm more observer of situations. So if I will not be speaking in the law jargon, please excuse me. First of all, congratulations with the Law Day. I think it's a very important day for everybody, because rule of law, as it was mentioned, affects everybody, like climate affects everybody in this world. Now, after seeing these numbers in the presentation, I cannot get rid of the feeling that most of the world still lives under Babylonian system of law. And I refer to famous Babylonian tractate of Hammurabi's law or code, where he divided population in 3 categories. So even today, we have a different categories of people have a different rules and different laws. I mean, every developed society has rules and laws. I mean, it's not that we lack rules or laws. What we are seeing that this application is segregated by different clusters of society. And it's not necessarily based on race or gender, but it's more based on, you know, who is on the top and who is in the bottom, you know, who is rich, who is not, and those kind of other variables. And so we see that Babylonian system versus the liberal system, when everybody should be equal to the law, is not the case in the world. So that's the first observation, that we see this fragmentation back to 2,600 years ago. What's important to mention here is that these fluctuations coincide, in my opinion, with the ideological crisis, or the crisis of ideas, or competing narratives, or competing ideologies in the world. What we see now is that when Cold War was over, we declared that liberal democracy is a winner, and you know, there were a long line of people and countries trying to jump on the boat in the liberal democracy. Today, unfortunately, the situation is different. We have a number of very powerful and big countries challenging liberal democracy and liberal world order, and they are offering their alternative methodology, which is not necessarily based on the rule of law as we understand it. And those countries have a different experiences with it. And I'll just bring one example, that in Soviet Union, the most notorious criminals and hands of the organized crimes were called thieves in law, because they had their own system of the law, which were they enforcing very vigorously, like any mafia or any, you know, organized crime groups do that. So, you know, the notion that there should be a law and order exists in every society. But what we see now, this fragmentation, that different segments of society have different applications and different laws. Second observation that I want to share with you is that it's quite obvious that players in this field are not only the nation states anymore. We see the globalization when, you know, non-state actors can be a positive or negative players in this field. From the positive, I can name the even organization like the ABA, promoting rule of law, not only domestically but internationally, the rights of international and local NGOs that are advocating, or think tanks, watchdogs that are promoting agenda. But we also see organizations like ISIS. We also see other organizations, I don't want to go into naming and shaming, that are advocating completely different realities. And now we see, on top of that, we were kind of comfortable talking about Western companies proliferating their activities, free trade, and introducing new, more, you know, liberal, you know, corporate governance. You know, no corruption, accountability, and etc. etc. Now we have a competition that we have semi-independent financial institutions and organizations are not sticking to those rules anymore. We see that, you know, some companies, very powerful and big companies, actually embracing corruption for their gain, and they don't have any rules to adhere because their country of origins do not demand that. So this competition blurs the picture, and in my understanding, it creates very solid distortion to the effort to promote the rule of law. Now, those countries that are trying to change, I'll go back to the history and recall the Thucydides, who claims that there are three motivations for any action. The countries behave like people. They also have a motivation to change or not change. And he names the phobos, the fear, the doxa, belief or religion or ideology, and kerdos, which is the self-benefit. So we've seen countries changing, like countries of Eastern Europe, Eastern and Central Europe, including my country, changing for self-interest, that we want to be part of the West. And if we want to be part of the West, we have to change ourselves in accordance to the standards that are with the European and Euro-Atlantic community. So that's a very strong motivation. So some countries change for ideological reasons, that they create their ideological constraints. And we've seen the rise of ISIS, or we've seen many other cases, the Taliban and others that are building everything on the ideological basis. And we see even countries that inside they have this ideologically motivated rules and laws. And good example is Russia, when part of it, Chechnya, is together with the constitution of Russia, is pretty much adhering the Sharia law. I don't know how these two work together, but that's the reality. So in this, transformative power is important because, by default, there will be no drive to achieve bigger change, and that's for sure. Another factor that is very seriously impacting changes that we've seen here is information. We believe that information has to be free, and we believe that everybody can express their opinion, but also we've seen enormous and very, unfortunately, very successful attempts to manipulate this information. And not only in a developing country, but in developed countries as well. So all of that gives you a background how these things happen and why they happen. Now, on the practical side, those countries that went through these changes discovered something very interesting. Obviously, the changes are always spearheaded by political elites. So if we want to change something, NGOs will not change it. NGOs will be helpful to change. Government has to change. Political leadership has to be willing to change. And when you start there, you discover that simple laws are easier than complicated laws. Simple laws, you have more means and tools to realize and implement in the life, and complicated rules and laws are, attracting corruption, or are becoming the ground for corruption. So why I'm mentioning this? Because as Ms. Anderson mentioned, it's a very complex issue. And in this complexity, there are no one, cookie cutter solutions or easy solutions that you will reform the judiciary and everything will be fine, or you will reform the courts, everything will be fine, or you will, have a vibrant civil society and will be fine. Unfortunately, it's not working that way. Like fighting corruption cannot be attributed to only one, spatial department or bureau. It should be a job of the entire government. The same way, the rule of law cannot be successfully implemented if it's only one agency or two agencies dealing with it, and if it's not entire government, entire society part of those changes. What we see now in the globe is that the societies and leaderships are confused. They're confused because of these competitions that I mentioned. They're confused because of manipulation with information that I mentioned, and they're confused because there are so many increased threats that are not that distance that it used to be. It's now kind of affects all of us, being it the hackers or the coronavirus. So it's globalization not only for businesses, but for everything else. And the rule of law is no exception.
Thank you very much. Lots to chew on there, including the very contested nature of this rule of law concept in today's world, non-state actors who are pushing and pulling on our governance, varied incentives from different actors in different contexts, the role of information, and then, of course, the critical element of political will to drive change. So we'll circle back to you, Ambassador, to hear more about how, what tools we have to drive that change. But I want to bring Jenny and Ashley into the conversation and get their perspective on rule of law dynamics and how rule of law progress occurs over time. Jenny, can I start with you and give us maybe a European Union perspective? The rule of law is a very hot topic there these days, and tell us how you see things playing out.
Yes, thank you. And thank you, Vincent, for having me here today. I would just like to note that the views presented here today are my own and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Law Library of Congress. So let's just jump right in. You said that, yeah, it's really currently a hot topic in the European Union, defending the rule of law. And all of you might have heard about it or read in the news that there's a conditionality regime that the European Union now introduced to protect the European Union's budget in case of rule of law deficiencies. And this new regime entered into force on January 1st, 2021. But Poland and Hungary have already lodged an action against this new regime before the Court of Justice of the European Union in March of 2021. So we'll see what the court says with regard to the legality of this new conditionality regime, because you have to see the background actually for adopting this new conditionality regime were actually the actions of Hungary and Poland. So it's quite clear that they are against it. And they have there were several infringement procedures that have been instigated by the European Commission against Poland and Hungary. Some have already been resolved by the court and some are still pending. And then there's also Article 7 proceedings, which are sanctions proceedings, which have been initiated against them, against Poland in December of 2017, against Hungary in 2018. But let me back up a little bit and just briefly describe the European Union rule of law framework, so we have a background for this whole conditionality regime, and then it might be a little easier to understand. So the rule of law is one of the fundamental values that the European Union is based on, and it's codified in Article 2 of the Treaty on European Union. And it also says that the rule of law is common to all European Union member states. But there's no definition of the rule of law, and they just says the union is based on this value and other fundamental values that are mentioned in this article. So the European Union and its member states have to respect the rule of law and also promote and protect it abroad. So not only within the EU, but also abroad. And then there are several procedures for breaches of the rule of law. And some are soft law procedures and some are hard law procedures. So there's, for example, a special cooperation verification mechanism for Bulgaria and Romania, which was inserted in there when they acceded to the European Union. So because the Commission thought that they still needed some reforms, especially with regard to the judiciary. So each year there's a progress report on how they're doing. And then there's a new rule of law framework, which was established in 2014. It's also just a soft law mechanism, though, by the Commission, and it's a three-stage dialogue. So the European Commission says in a certain member state, we see there's some deficiencies. It's kind of like a measure, it's when there's a perceived threat to the rule of law. So they're trying to avoid the hard law procedures. They're trying to catch all these rule of law breaches before they actually come into existence. So it's a dialogue between the Commission and the member state in question. But yeah, it's not binding. And actually this has been used with regard to Poland. And then the Polish government issued a paper saying, well, we disagree with the assessment of the Commission. And so far there has been no result. So yeah, it's a start, but it's not necessarily so helpful every time when the member state in question is not cooperative. And then there's also the Council of the European Union. They have an annual dialogue with the member states on the rule of law, which is also, they pick a specific topic and talk about this. And then since 2020, there's also another soft law instrument, which they call the rule of law mechanism. So there they produce a rule of law report, which assesses the general rule of law in the European Union and then has a chapter on each member state. So these are all soft law mechanisms, and they don't have any binding legal effect. But then there's also some hard law procedures, which is, for example, the infringement procedures that I mentioned against Poland and Hungary, and obviously can also be used against other member states. But this is for specific EU law violations. And then also national courts may refer questions of compatibility of national law with European Union law to the Court of Justice of the European Union. So then they can get a ruling there. And then there's this Article 7 procedure that I mentioned, which should only be used actually as a last resort. So it actually has like two prongs, and one is like preemptive measures, basically. So when there's a threat to the rule of law, and there's not a breach yet. And then there's the second part, which is the sanctions regime. So that's only activated when there's already a serious and persistent threat to the rule of law. And there are different procedures with regard to Poland and Hungary now. They actually activated the Article 7 procedure, but not the sanctions mechanism yet, but just a preemptive mechanism, basically. Because as a last resort, they can actually suspend membership rights, so voting rights, for example. So this should only be used as last resort. But yeah, I mean, the thing is, this is why this new conditionality regime was actually introduced, is so far all these measures in place were not successful. And the European Parliament said, well, the situation is actually worsening in Hungary and in Poland. I actually took a look at your index, and I think Hungary was ranked the lowest among the European Union member states. So this conditionality regime was introduced because especially Hungary and Poland, they are receiving a lot of money from the EU budget. So this conditionality regime, under this regime, they can suspend or interrupt or reduce or terminate payments to the member state. So I think, well, this is a little more tangible. If they don't get the money that they need, maybe then something will change. So obviously, this is also a reason why this new conditionality regime was opposed by Hungary and Poland. And what they did actually was, at the same time, they were debating the EU multi-annual budget and also the Next Generation EU Recovery Fund, which has money for the economic recovery from the pandemic. So it's a lot of money, especially this recovery fund has 750 billion euros, as far as I know. So this money is needed in order to restart the economy. And they were blocking the adoption of this budget. They said, well, we don't want this conditionality regime. So then in the European Council, they actually had a compromise. And they said, well, we'll pass this regulation, but the Commission will not use it before they will first issue guidelines on how they will implement it and how they will use it. And we'll also wait until until the Court of Justice of the European Union has ruled on the legality. So that's actually quite interesting. So then Poland and Hungary agreed, and that's why it got adopted. Because the European Council, where this compromise was made, is actually a political body. So it's not one of the bodies that makes the laws in the European Union. But they still, in this case, this compromise has legal effects because the regulation on the conditionality regime will not be put into effect until these guidelines are passed and until the court rules on it. So this is actually, it's quite complex and very interesting because now they have this regime where they can sanction rule of law deficiencies, but they cannot actually use it. So it's actually, yeah, the way that they made this agreement actually, you could say, undermines the rule of law in a way. And the European Parliament has actually thought about suing the European Commission for inaction and for not using the regulation. So I think it's a very interesting but very complex legal topic, and hopefully you can talk about this a little more in detail later on.
Absolutely. Thank you for that tutorial on what I've watched from afar and perceived to be very complicated, and can certainly see that it is. And it seems like in some ways what's playing out in the European Union is what Ambassador Iakobishvili was suggesting, was that, you know, in order to see progress on rule of law, there needs to be really agreement, you know, within government, in a whole of government kind of approach. And what we see right now in the European Union is a real rift around this idea, what it means, how important it is, and how it should be enforced. So very challenging. Ashley, I'm going to turn to you and ask you to take us to another part of the world. You focused a lot of your research on rule of law and security issues, particularly in Africa. And I'm interested in how you see rule of law dynamics playing out there.
Absolutely. Thank you so much to the ABA and to the Law Library. This is my first law day, so it's a privilege to be here with all of you. And yes, you know, I'm struck by the other remarks of Jenny and the Ambassador, and thinking about how closely aligned the trends and dynamics of rule of law really are with democracy, and sort of the trend lines of how democracies are performing more or less democratic. And certainly the case of Hungary and Poland, I think in the sort of rule of law dynamics there seem to mirror that trend. But in terms of Africa, you know, one of the things that I looked at a lot is this sort of idea of the neighborhood effect, or sort of the diffusion of practices across different countries. And I think really what we have seen a lot of in Africa, especially pre-coronavirus, was this trend of rule by law rather than rule of law. We've seen really over the course of the last decade or more, you know, the law being a tool by governments, but a tool to clamp down on fundamental rights of speech, assembly, and even on sort of free political competition. I think one of the most influential laws in this case was the 2009 Charities and Societies Proclamation in Ethiopia, which was a law that restricted the funding that civil society groups that conduct advocacy and human rights work and conflict resolution work, the funding that they could receive from non-domestic sources. And it really was a revolutionary law in the sense that it dramatically deflated this whole kind of sector of civil society in Ethiopia. And we saw this law really being copycatted. It was exported around the world and to many other countries in Africa, like Rwanda, like Zambia, like Tanzania, and used as a way for these increasingly really authoritarian leaders to crack down on dissent. And what we saw in Ethiopia and in other places was the civil society law quickly followed by other kinds of laws, again, to restrict kind of these areas of free expression, media laws, cybersecurity laws, which are primarily used you know, to kind of close political space cracking down on everything from election monitors in Tanzania to censoring journalists from providing negative coverage or critique of government. And I think this last point has become very important in this time of the pandemic, because many governments are using these existing laws or adopting new laws to restrict space under the guise of people or groups who are providing misinformation about the virus, but really with it's journalists and civil society groups who might be critiquing a government response, but they're being sort of persecuted under the auspices of this law. Newspapers have been shut down. Tanzania is a sort of notorious case for this, very poor pandemic response, and the use of the law by the government to shut down newspapers, to fine journalists, and other restrictions on free expression. So I think it's interesting, Betsy, that you talk about when you measure rule of law in the World Justice Project Index, some of these dimensions around constraints on power, around the suppression of rights, et cetera. And I think you can see, in some cases, the law being a tool to sort of expand that power and then kind of constrain rights as part of that, and then sort of reflected in the downgrading or the negative ratings on rule of law, I'm sure. But I think another dimension too, I think that in Africa has been exacerbated, again, particularly by this time of the pandemic in the terms of rule of law, is the way in which it has further unleashed security forces, which can be pretty notorious for their brutality, their human rights abuses in places like Kenya and Nigeria. But it's allowed them to act in more predatory ways towards citizens, because one of the dimensions of the pandemic has been, in many cases, the imposition of emergency law. So massive expansion of executive power, massive retraction of kind of civil liberties and such. And so we've seen security forces really commit very horrible human rights abuses under the auspices of enforcing curfews. South Africa and Kenya and Nigeria, I think, are some of the most notorious cases. And I think, but this is sort of a new dimension of a problem that already existed. So again, to the point that these things don't suddenly come out of nowhere, these are institutions which themselves are rarely subject to the rule of law, meaning that they frequently commit abuses and frequently engage in corrupt activity, but they're rarely themselves subject to the rule of law, held accountable or otherwise constrained in their interactions with the public, even though they are, as we know, the primary enforcers of public safety and the law in the public sphere. And I think this really has the effect of, over time, of degrading the legitimacy of these institutions, like law enforcement, like government, more broadly. And I think, if I'm incorrect, please correct me, Betsy, but I think that the World Justice Project is a perceptions based on surveys or based on feedback from people who are experiencing how they perceive the rule of law in their countries. And I think that's very telling, because it sort of gives you an insight into the legitimacy that citizens have or feel toward their institutions that are administering the rule of law. And it really gives you a sense of if those institutions, if those laws really do have the legitimacy of the public.
Great. Yes. Well, our index, just on that last point, it does draw on surveys of citizens and practitioners, both of their perceptions and their experience. So depending on the topic, we may ask them a perception question, or we may ask them a question, have you been solicited for a bribe in the last year, kind of experience question. And we find both of them quite useful to get a perspective on the rule of law in practice, as you say. But thank you for that survey, really also not only of rule of law dynamics in Africa, but in the particular impact of the pandemic, which I should say, the data that I shared with you was a snapshot of the rule of law. We released that report on March 11th, 2020, which was the day that the pandemic was declared by the World Health Organization. So that is pre-pandemic data, which was already as I mentioned, going in the wrong direction. The 2021 index will be out this fall, and we anticipate, for exactly the reasons that you are pointing to, some deterioration, further deterioration in a number of areas as the pandemic has put stress on exactly the areas: corruption, constraints on government powers, fundamental rights that were already under threat. But let me see if we can't find a hopeful note. And let me ask my panelists to share with us their ideas and experience of what works in improving the rule of law. What are the tools that we have in our toolbox? The Biden administration has declared that it will be conducting a values-based foreign policy, that they plan to convene a democracy summit and to be advocating for rule of law. And I'm interested in your thoughts and experience about what the US government or the US and other governments can do to promote the rule of law, and to what extent some of the rule of law challenges in the US may make it difficult for the US to play a leadership role going forward. Maybe Ashley, I'm going to flip the order of our speakers and start with you.
Sure. So, yeah, I think that you're right. There is a values-based vision for foreign policy. We heard about it yesterday in President Biden's speech to the joint session of Congress. And I do think that that particular aspects of rule of law will be a focus of the new administration in terms of their broader policy on democracy. And I think there's a real, first of all, I think, this issue around the credibility of the US in engaging in this space, I think we absolutely have to acknowledge the challenges that the United States has faced. But I think that there's no question that there is much work to do in our work in this globally, and that we kind of have to walk and chew gum at the same time and work aggressively on both ends. So I'm optimistic that we can do that, and that there's a vision for doing that. And I think on the summit and more broadly on opportunities, we're definitely going to see, I think, a focus on corruption in particular as an aspect of rule of law, as an aspect of democracy that is an opportunity to help shore up struggling democracies, or more less resilient democracies, but also to demonstrate what I think the president talked about last night, which is that democracies can really deliver. And I think there's been a little bit of sort of brand management that's sort of happening around trying to demonstrate that democracies are yes about protecting these fundamental rights and freedoms, but they can deliver meaningful results to people. And this experience with corruption is one of those places that's really eroded the sort of brand of many democracies around the world. And I think there's a couple of interesting ways that might happen. For example, through the creation of new kind of standards around corruption that could be kind of a race to the top model, where it's sort of voluntary compliance by countries to want to sort of to demonstrate their adherence to good anti-corruption practices. There'll certainly be a great need for this kind of work in the pandemic, where we have large packages of aid going out to governments while they try to respond to the medical and the economic crisis. So there is a great need also to help with building these mechanisms of oversight over that aid distribution and making sure that it's being used efficiently and effectively, and getting directly to those who need it. So I do think there's sort of great opportunity to come together around maybe new anti-corruption measures in the context of the pandemic, and in community with other democratic countries, even as we are working on our own rule of law challenges at home.
Great. I'm going to invite Ambassador Yakubashvili back into the conversation because I'm very interested in his reaction to Ashley's ideas. And I know, Ambassador, you've been involved in both transition in your own country and in other neighboring countries. And I'd be interested in your experience and perspective on what works and what's helpful or not from allies like the United States.
First of all, I will start from what Ashley mentioned, and it's very important. She mentioned that a number of countries started to adopt new regulations restricting freedom of information and restricting many other activities of NGOs. Unfortunately, we see the origins of this new legislation, and you can look around and you will see in most of the autocratic countries this is happening. But this is much wider than we expect or is reported. The Library of Congress published a couple of very interesting articles about domestication of information. What basically it means that, you know, social media platforms that proliferate free speech will be monitored, will be, you know, managed, will be fined, will be sanctioned, and etc. and etc. And we see it's not only that you are shrinking the breeding ground for advocacy groups and independent NGOs, but also manipulating with the social media that a lot of autocratic countries see as a threat. So that's a very worrying trend. When it comes to fighting corruption, and based from my experience, I can tell you that I already mentioned that creating only 1 or 2 or 5 anti-corruption bureaus and threatening with punishment is not going to work. The corruption is effectively dealt when you are conducting systemic changes, when you are eliminating the breeding ground for corruption, and over-regulation, you know, the zealous to implement 2,000 different rules. I mean, I'll give you a very simple example. We had a problem of cigarette smuggling. And we had 2 solutions. One solution was that we kind of add 500 more men to law enforcement agency to control it, or we do some more economic measure and not law enforcement measure. So we ended up doing something very extraordinary. We reduced the cigarette access price. And cigarettes became cheaper in Georgia than in the neighboring countries. So what we have seen, what our Ministry of Finance was fearing, that we will see less money coming in, we actually saw more money coming in because cigarettes were smuggled from Georgia because it was cheaper. So the law enforcement and punitive measures are not always the answer to fighting corruption. We would most likely see from these 500 new policemen, 10 or 100 being corrupted because economically it makes sense. They will benefit out of it. So taking more economic action, political actions against the corruption are more effective tools than, you know, punitive measures. And if you do so, then we will punish you. You know, punishment is increasing the price of interaction, nothing more. It's like in drug dealing or any other illegal activities. Now, on the toolbox of the US, I mean, we have to, understand that what Biden said yesterday, there is nothing new. US foreign policy, de facto or perception, was always value-based. At least if you go around the globe and ask about your foreign policy, everybody will tell you the same thing, that, yeah, these guys are promoting democracy, human rights, this and that, and they mix it with foreign policy. I mean, it may not be the case with every single administration, but perception in the rest of the world is that American foreign policy is always the value-based. There is no news there. What is news is that American tools are antiquated. These tools are old and not functioning properly. These tools were invented after Second World War, during the Cold War, or right after the Cold War when everybody were happy and kumbaya. But today we see the different world. Today we see the challenges that we have. As I mentioned, we see the attempts to restrict the social media, which many people here believe in the US that this is a very active tool for promoting democracy. Autocracies found ways to manage them. So that says that United States has to start thinking. I understand it's not easy to revamp its toolbox and come with a new tools. There are very good concrete steps in that direction on all levels. And anti-propaganda or managing the anti-propaganda, fight against hacking. I mean, this is a full swing. You see everywhere among NGOs in the government. That's a good beginning. We are not there yet, but it's a good beginning. USAID has to be completely revamped. Hopefully the new leadership will do that, and I know that they have plans. And any other institutions that you can imagine. All of them have to be updated to modern realities, that we have a big power competitions back, and technology is giving them even more tools for manipulations that previously available.
Okay, great. That's very insightful and helpful, and gives us lots to chew on. Jenny, I'm interested in your perspective. Your description earlier of the dynamics in the European Union suggests a grasping for tools as well in managing rule of law dynamics within the union and perhaps also in external relations. I wonder what you might be able to share with us in terms of effective tools for promoting the rule of law.
Sure, yeah. Also, that was all very interesting what my co-panelists said. And yeah, like you said, I mean, the European Union is really grappling now with reform of the rule of law procedures and trying to find new ways to protect and promote the rule of law. But also with regards to, and at an international level, the cooperation with the US is also very important to the European Union. So they actually, in just December 2020, they issued, they call it the new US-EU Agenda for Global Change. So it's a good name. And it also specifically mentions the Democracy Summit and says the EU is ready to play its full part. So, I mean, the EU and the US have been partners for more than 70 years. And it's always been a good partnership. And they will say, they want to work with the US, but also with other international partners to further the commitments on fighting corruption, especially authoritarianism and human rights abuses around the world. So in general, they want to strengthen the multilateral system. And I think that's very important to work with several partners across the globe and finding common positions and helping each other. And also what the EU has been doing, and other countries probably as well, now that they're reforming the rule of law framework or trying to reform this framework, they've done public consultations which involved multiple stakeholders. And I think that's also very important to get the different perspective, especially from civil society on certain measures, that it's not only government, but that civil society is included, that you have these different perspectives. And then another thing which is important is just educating the public. Also recently they did a survey in the European Union, and most like 80%, 90% of the people, they all said the rule of law is very important. They also asked about different aspects of the rule of law. They also it's important, but then also, interestingly enough, more than 50% said they also feel that they're not informed. They don't actually know enough about the rule of law or how the rule of law can protect them, what legal remedies they can do if there's corruption in their country, what they can do to remedy the situation. So it's also very important events like today to talk about the rule of law and help people understand what it is, what it entails is very important. And then what Ashley was mentioning, that the media is centered, for example, this is also one of the things that the EU recognizes. They said, well, we have to promote media pluralism. So they're promoting media pluralism and giving funding to the media so that we have unbiased information, and what Timur was, the ambassador was saying, that there's no false information, that people can be informed. So that's all very important, I think. And that's also what the EU is trying to promote. And I think that's also what the US is trying. And yeah, in this partnership, hopefully this can be promoted and achieved.
Great. That's all very interesting to hear about, and we'll certainly be watching. We've got lots of questions coming in, so I think I'm going to turn to starting to field some of those and put them to my panelists. Let me begin with one, and maybe Jenny, since your screen is on and your mic is off, or on, muted is off. Start with you. The question, because you have this perspective on a bunch of different regime types within Europe. The question is, do you see a difference in rule of law in parliamentary versus presidential systems? And I might broaden the question and ask panelists to think about different kinds of regime types as well. What impact does that have on rule of law?
Yeah, I mean, I don't really see a difference in the different regimes. I mean, the European Union has both parliamentary system, presidential systems. And it's not, and you can also not generalize that it's maybe, let's say, Eastern European countries that came from communism that are more where the rule of law is deteriorating more. It's really all over, especially now with the pandemic. You can see that rights are restricted in all European Union countries. So really, it doesn't, the system doesn't make a difference, or where they're coming from. It's really all over the place where you can see the deterioration, unfortunately. But yeah, it doesn't make a difference. It's really, just that.
Right. Okay. Ashley, let me invite your perspective on that question about regime type.
Yeah, I've never really looked specifically into this question, but it's interesting just in terms of thinking about the question of kind of just checks and balances. I always sort of think of parliamentary systems as being more unified, governed in a more unified government kind of way, just because of the structure of the system, and such that, there's fewer opportunities in those systems for sort of checks on that party, that governing coalition's, agenda, whatever that may be, including on the rule of law, but a variety of other areas. And so I don't know what the implications are for that. I think certainly in places in Africa where I've worked, it's certainly harder to, when you have parliamentary governments that are abusing the rule of law, that are governing by fiat, kind of how I described before, and you really don't have a role. Like opposition has a very limited, if any, presence or role in the process of governing. It's really hard to sort of to dismantle those dynamics. There's really just very limited impact that they can have, and that's when it's very important to have some of these other parts of society, right, to provide the oversight over government, in that case, to have the media, to have civil society. So I think, in those cases, I would say that's why it is, I think we've said multiple times here, it's a very much a whole of society enterprise. And I think we need to have sort of resiliencies and pockets in different parts of society, so that if the state, itself, or the government is kind of mostly a one party or a one coalition entity, that there's other places to find accountability in that way.
Okay, Ambassador, do you have a perspective on this question?
Actually, I do. In short version, my perspective is that for good life, parliamentary system is the best. For turbulent life, presidential system is the better. It's very much like when you build an organization. Every organization has this quest for Holy Grail, and Holy Grail for organization is endowment. So once you have endowment in place, you can relax. You elect your CEO, or president. If you don't like, replace, but organization will not suffer financially that much. The same way, when you are in the process of reforms, you better have a presidential system, because parliamentary system offers a lot of weaknesses and room for manipulation for external actors. And these weaknesses will be always exploited, and we've seen it. So for transitional period, presidential system is better. Once you achieve stability and tranquility, and you have NATO protecting your borders, and etc., then probably parliamentary system is better. But the worst system is the combination of these two. And a good example for that is Ukraine. Because president may have very noble ideas, but cannot get through the parliament, and vice versa. So
Okay.
that's so you better choose one and stick with that one. But if you are in transition, stick with the presidential. When
I
you
have
are,
a question that's come in that raises another branch of government that we haven't talked about much, and I'm interested, and that is, what's the role of an independent judiciary in all of this?
critical.
Where do you see them
The
playing a
role
role?
of independent judiciary is absolutely critical. Without independent, look what's the problem. The problem is that tendency of every government, especially the authoritarian government, is to have as much as power as possible, which includes subduing parliament and making it a rubber stamp institution and judiciary. That's an inclination of every government in the world. It doesn't matter democratic, non-democratic. But if you have an independent judiciary, it can balance it. It can balance it, and it can open the other venue for other players to be active in the political arena. We see a lot of nihilism about population who say that it doesn't matter who is in power, everybody's equally evil. So, and that's very much exploited by the autocrats, that nihilism. But if you have an independent judiciary that you can legally challenge results of certain actions, and be sure that it will be, you may not like the outcome, but you are sure that it's independent from the government, then you have a chance. It's not a guarantee, but then you have a chance. And then you have a drive for change. But if you don't have this independent judiciary, then it's kind of, so what? It doesn't matter whose name is up there, everybody's equally evil. And despair comes. So that's from that perspective, and then from my personal belief, it's absolutely crucial. Now, how to build it? That's the big multi-billion or euro-dollar question. Because as a friend of mine from Bulgaria once said, building independent judiciary is like advancing on the graveyard. No help is expected.
Well, can I just jump in here and just
Yes.
echo the critical importance of an independent judiciary in a society, especially again, as the ambassador said, this oversight over executives. The first thing that you sort of, when I look at places and I start to get kind of worried, there are two places I look. One is what's going on with the media, and do we have this kind of crackdowns on media, censorship, arrest of journalists, et cetera. And the other thing I see is when executives start playing around with the courts and they start removing justices or packing the court with their own supporters, especially, they will do it right in advance of an election so they can be sure to control the dispute resolution process with regard to an election. So it really is a kind of bellwether for kind of the democratic trajectory of the country broadly, but also the experience that citizens are going to have in that country vis-a-vis their interactions, with the state. Is the judiciary going to be the kind of protector of citizen rights vis-a-vis the state or vis-a-vis other bad actors, or are they going to kind of be the enforcer of whatever the state's view is? And so I think it's a critically important thing. I think it's a very hard thing to build up from an external donor kind of perspective. It's these are sovereign institutions, and sometimes there's a lot of sensitivity with outside actors coming in, and so I think that's sometimes a sensitive area, but it's also something that requires really, really long-term investments, and donors don't always want to make those kind of long-term investments, but it really is, I think, a super important area.
And Jenny, it certainly, in the EU dynamic, may ultimately come to the European Court of Justice to sort all of this and make some of this soft law hard, no?
Yeah, I can only agree with what Ashley and the ambassador said. And actually, so the Court of Justice of the European Union had actually said that effective judicial review is the most important, the essential element of the rule of law. And if people can't seek effective judicial review, there's no rule of law. So, and actually, the cases, the infringement procedures, and all the cases against Poland and Hungary, they are mostly about the independence of the judiciary. So this is really, the focus of these cases, because they're saying these judges are not independent anymore. And also this new conditionality regime, it defines the rule of law, and one of the elements is really effective judicial protection and by independent and impartial justices. So this is really one of the core elements, and that needs to be protected. And because otherwise, if there's no checks and balances on executive power, then there's no rule of law. So this is really the most important.
There's a very interesting follow-up question that's been posed, which is really goes to the question of legitimacy of the judiciary, and that flows from independence and partiality, but maybe also from its representativeness. And the question is, what about the need for diversity, equity, inclusion in the judiciary in order for a diverse citizenry to have confidence in it? Thoughts about that dynamic in judiciaries?
In my personal opinion, it's less relevant. And I'll tell you why. I mean, in Georgia, for example, we have a lot of women being judges. They're not better judges because they are women. In some cases, they're so evil you cannot even imagine. Same goes to men. So it's not about gender. It's about if they're independent or not. And I don't see any correlation on their independency based on their gender. At least in my country, probably it's different in other countries. What I see other countries trying to do, and all participants know very well that the independent judiciary is a very serious prerequisite for serious foreign investment. Okay, no company gonna come to you and invest unless they are charlatans or this is a government-owned companies if you don't have an independent judiciary properly functioning. So some countries, let's say Kazakhstan, they created the free economic zone, and they did not select a justice from their own country. They invited British justice, showing to the rest of the world so that it's not us. You will not be dealing with us. Here is a British law. In this particular economic zone, there is a British law with British justice, with British, it happens that it's headed by a female, which I'm very glad, but, that matters more. The trust is an essential here than gender.
Okay, we have, I can't believe it, come close to the end of our time together. This has been an hour and a half that has flown by. I want to ask our panelists in just 1 minute to sum up your wish for our world, for a better rule of law over the next year when we convene to celebrate Law Day a year from now. What do you wish for us in strengthening the rule of law over the next year? And Ambassador, let me start with you.
I wish 3 things. First, for advancing rule of law, no single country can do it properly. No America, no Germany or France. I think that Euro-Atlantic unity is essential. So Americans and European Union and individual European countries have to get together and get their act together and promote it jointly. Otherwise, the fragmented approach is not going to work. That's one. Second, I wish that, this pandemic will not only expedite what was already happening, but also push the governments in the United States and Europe to renew tools for engagement with the rest of the world. And third, there was an interesting question if America should be a world policeman. I'm expressing my personal point of view, and I am quoting somebody else. It's not my idea. I'm fine for America being a world policeman, but not being the world preacher. Okay? So America should not go and preach how to live, but enforce the law when it can. And we are talking about human rights and those kinds of things. We are not talking about, internal business disputes or whatever. Okay? So America and Europe have to get back their soft power, and it is as important as the hard power.
Okay. Thank you very much for that. Ashley, let me turn to you, your wish for our rule of law.
Yeah, so I think one of the ambassador mentioned it, one of the key elements for me for rule of law is fundamentally about trust. And I think this last year has been a test of trust like nothing we've ever seen, and has citizens have had to be willing to voluntarily give up their freedom to the state, to voluntarily make sacrifices, to stay inside, to follow stay-at-home orders, to do unpleasant things like wear masks, and the high trust societies have done better. The ones who have trusted their institutions and been willing to comply, and at the same time where the institutions have shown citizens why they needed to have that compliance and what the benefit to them would be. So this feedback mechanism, I think, is how we build trust. And your World Justice Project data showed that it's hard to get that rule of law. It's hard to build that trust. But it's really easy to destroy it. It erodes really quickly. And so my hope is that we start to rebuild some of the trust that has been lost, and that more and more people will have confidence in their institutions to feel that they can go there and seek remedy, to feel that they can go to the police and receive protection, and not feel distrustful and distant and excluded from those institutions.
Great. Yes, rule of law is certainly foundational to that trust.
Mm-hmm.
Your wish for the rule of law.
Yes, I can only echo the sentiments expressed here. And I would like to add that, even though I've been talking a lot about breaches of the rule of law, I think recognizing, first of all, that there's a problem is already a good start, and trying to improve the rule of law, promoting the rule of law, that's a good start. And especially that, we need to strengthen the multilateral system. We all need to work together in order to promote the rule of law worldwide. No country can do it alone. And I think it's also, inviting different stakeholders, and so getting the different views, because there's no one size that fits all. And I'm hoping that if we involve everyone, civil society and governments, that we can find a good solution to all these problems. I think just realizing there is a problem, there is a need for reform, just constantly working on it, that's a good start. And I think that's, even though there are breaches, that makes me hopeful for the future.
Oh, great. My hope is more conversations like this, which make us all smarter about the rule of law and give us the tools and insights that we need to advance it. Will, thank you for your leadership in bringing us together, and I turn the podium over to you.
Well, thank you very, very much, Betsy. I greatly appreciate it. I want to thank you and each of our panelists for your thought-provoking and informative discussion today. I've reflected on, and it's given me so much food for thought when we think about the rule of law as a function of both experience and perception, and certainly being about trust and whether or not citizens trust the system that they're involved in. And then when I reflect upon such things as we must transition in some nations from law of the ruler to the rule of law, and that it is about the rule of law rather than simply rule by law. I'm still processing that, and that is a valuable framework. Ladies and gentlemen, I just want to thank you for joining us today. I'd like to thank the ABA's partner, the Law Library of Congress, for this event. I invite you to learn more about Law Day and remaining Law Day activities by going to www.lawday.org. And I especially would like to invite you to a program on May 12th, which will be at 6 o'clock Eastern Time. And that program will be focused on issues of access and accountability. And please, in the chat function here, there's information about a survey, and I believe you'll also be receiving an email that gives you an opportunity to provide feedback about this program and about what we can do better in the future. So again, thank you for participating. Have a great day.